My name is Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. I'm the senior rabbi of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. The synagogue has been around for over 100 years. We have over 2,000 members who are part of our community. Plus, we broadcast my sermons. We transcribe some of them and circulate the text and stream our services. So eventually, thousands of additional people actually are exposed to our congregation, not only to my sermons, also to other activities that we do, and to our services, our Shabbat and festival services. But specifically about the sermons, I would say, depending on any particular presentation, thousands of people are exposed to them.
Okay, great. So here we are, almost 2 months into this latest Gaza war. And people are very, very upset on many different levels. What face does the anguish come from in your particular congregation? Is there a dilemma, and what do you tell them?
Well, of course there's a dilemma. Any decent person has a dilemma in general about war. War is always the last option. It's never the first option. In particular, in our neck of the woods, we're in the heart of New York City. Most of the members of our community are liberals, progressives, and we are particularly anguished about that. So there is this tension that exists all along about, in general, about trying to resolve the conflict peacefully in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And when there's a war that breaks out, to try and do the best that you possibly can to minimize civilian casualties. What is difficult for those of us who live in the blessings of a free society and relatively untouched by war, at least here in the homeland, it's often difficult for us to make the emotional connection and the intellectual connection that war is a very ugly thing. And that's why all of the efforts that we can possibly muster should be invested before the war breaks out to prevent war. But if it does break out, there's a lot of death and destruction, and innocent people die.
Yeah, but what about this Gaza thing? People have. I'm sort of going to take the other side here, not really a side, but I want to, point out that apparently so many Gazan civilians have been killed, including lots of children and all that, and that the swiftness and the sort of the overall force of the Israeli army in this situation is over the top in terms of many people. In terms of many people's thought that they've crossed a line here that's making some people's support for Israel waver.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, there were definitely, even by Israel's count, there were definitely hundreds, perhaps up to 1,000, and I'm referring to Israel's own count, 1,000 innocent Palestinians who died, and many thousands more, no doubt, who were wounded, both physically as well as emotionally, and were displaced. None of us are really, military experts, so we can't necessarily weigh in on, certainly not on each and every case, whether each and every case, was fully justified. But I can tell you this: first of all, there is no war, especially with a terrorist organization and an asymmetrical type of warfare. There is no war without civilians being harmed. And secondly, this idea that Israel purposely targets civilians or recklessly doesn't care is a big lie. It's a very big lie perpetrated by those who don't have Israel's interests at heart. And it's spoken and repeated in the hopes that such a big lie will ultimately become true because it's repeated so often. I can tell you also that it's not simply propaganda, it is true. There is no military in the history of warfare that took more care to prevent civilian casualties than the Israel Defense Forces. So again, and by the way, I would say to you, because of the coverage and because of the publicity of some of Israel's opponents, the other side is rarely spoken about. The enormous emotional, psychological, physical damage that was caused by indiscriminate rocket fire on the part of Palestinians, and the plans that they had that were prevented by the Israel Defense Forces. They had built a network of tunnels that literally tunneled underground into civilian neighborhoods on the Israel side of the Gaza border, and they actually intended to launch a massive attack on Rosh Hashanah, on the Jewish high holy days, to kill as many people as possible and to take captive as many people as possible and drag them back to the dungeons of Gaza. Can you only imagine what that would have done and how many more innocent people would have been killed if they had actually succeeded? So many of those civilian casualties were caused because Hamas either held captive Palestinian civilians or used them as human shields, or were recklessly disregarding their welfare and shot missiles and created command and control centers in the heart of neighborhoods, and not only that, in mosques, in schools, in hospitals, and other civilian facilities, including, by the way, United Nations facilities. So, broadly speaking, this was a war that Israel had no choice to fight. It's basic common sense. It's basic religious common sense. I can speak to you from the moral and religious perspective. You don't need a diploma or a doctorate in international relations to figure it out. If somebody's shooting at rockets at you, which is a war crime, you have to protect and defend yourself. How you do that is a relevant and important issue, and there are rules of war, and they are and should be followed. And where there are excesses or mistakes, people who do that should be held accountable. But this idea that Israel was reckless or purposely targeted civilians is a very big lie and should be rejected out of hand. And Israel shouldn't really be compared to Hamas in the first place. Hamas is an anti-Semitic, anti-Western, anti-feminist, anti-gay, anti-Christian terrorist group, and Israel is a liberal democracy, fighting for its life in a very, very bad neighborhood.
Well, I mean, you sort of equated, or sort of put in the same clause, this idea of the recklessness and the reckless or purposeful targeting of civilian populations. But I think that maybe cavalier would be the word that some people would use. That they said, okay, well, we'll hit that apartment building because we know there's some Hamas people in there, and there's collateral damage in the war. But that there was sort of an irresponsible willingness to let civilians be killed in order to achieve the war aims. But it doesn't sound like you buy that.
I don't buy that. I don't buy that on a kind of a principled level, and I don't buy that in terms of the implication to personnel, military personnel, and commanders of the IDF. I just don't buy that. I know what their ethos is. I know what their morality is. It's a very complicated situation on the ground. You can equate it with this. If you're sitting in your balcony, and on the other side of the street, there's a person who's shooting at you from his balcony, and he's holding his baby in his hand. What do? What should your response be? And that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma on a kind of a geopolitical and geostrategic level, but that's also the dilemma of the individual soldier who's being fired upon and needs to make a split-second decision whose life is at risk. So I'm not saying, again, in every single circumstance, the split-second decision on the ground, in retrospect, if you had 2 hours to analyze it in a classroom or in a university lecture hall, that in every single decision it was pure and the decision was right and there was no other option. But broadly speaking, the responsibility for everything that happened in Gaza was Hamas. Hamas decided to launch the war, and the way it ended, it was clear that Hamas decided to end the war too. By the way, the reason they ended the war is because they just simply had enough. They couldn't withstand the pressure anymore.
I mean, it's true what you're saying, but it's also true that most of the civilian casualties weren't from soldiers; they were from, bombs and missiles and stuff that was launched, in a very high tech and impressive way. And that's I think was where majority of the deaths came from, not from, your 19-year-old IDF soldier. But they did have a choice about whether they pushed the button there. I'm not.
Again, I can. It's hard to analyze every particular instance. I understand that.
Okay.
But
all right.
I would say to you, from what I understand, from what I gather from the media reports, brochures were dropped from planes. They were the residents in the places that they were going to bomb were texted and called on several occasions. They dropped dummy bombs before they actually dropped the real bombs. And what the Israelis reported was that Hamas actually, in one way or another, whether physically or politically, prevented many of those civilians from moving anywhere else.
Okay, great. Now, one last thing I want to tell you, which is going to really piss you off, but I mean, I've been speaking to some very left Jews here. And also, I don't know if you saw that thing on the Saturday New York Times, that ad that was taken out by all those Holocaust survivors, many of whom seem to be equating the walling off of the ghetto, for example, in Warsaw, with the blockade and sort of siege, as some people see it, of Gaza. That somehow, in both instances, there was that people were prevented from getting their basic necessities, and that they just decided to fight like hell rather than sort of languish and get sick or die or something. What do you think about these? I mean, people recognize that there's obviously a difference between the systematic decimation of the Jews, in gas chambers and stuff like that, and what's going on in Gaza, but that the ghetto analogy is more or less apt. What's your response to that?
I think the world has gone crazy. I think we have lost sight of what's upside down and what's right side up, and what's right and what's wrong, and what's good and what's bad. And it's a certain moral atrophy that is as perplexing as it is disconcerting and worrying. You're talking about a terrorist organization that launched indiscriminate fire against Israelis nonstop for 14 years. Israel went out of its way with all of its overwhelming military superiority. The reason it took so long was Israel went out of its way to prevent civilian casualties.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the years-long blockade of the Gaza Strip, from the sea and also from Egypt and that kind of thing. That somehow.
Yeah, the reason there's a blockade. Do you think that it's in Israel's interest to prevent a thriving Gaza? Not only from a humanitarian perspective, but from a political perspective. It's in Israel's interest that Gaza be thriving. The reason that, and now it should be clear to anyone of goodwill, that the reason the blockade was in there in the first place is because they used the raw material to arm. In the case of the cement that came in, rather than building buildings and schools and hospitals and buildings up to code, what they built were attack tunnels. So the reason there's a blockade in the first place is because Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority. And by the way, they killed many Palestinian Authority leaders and officials, and created, in a sense, a mini terrorist state on Israel's doorstep, and then initiated indiscriminate fire against Israeli civilians. So, what would anybody do? What would any country do? What would you do? I understand you're the interviewer here, but I'm turning to all the people who are listening to this. As I said again, if somebody is sitting across the street from you on his balcony and shooting at you with a baby in his hand, what would you do? And that's basically what's happening in Gaza. The Hamas, and again, Hamas is not the equivalent of Israel. Hamas is a terrorist organization, not as bad as ISIS, but on the same tree. It's a branch of the same tree.
Okay.
Hamas is and Israel is a liberal democracy and part of the family of Western nations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, last little thing, and then we'll be done. So, what do you tell your congregants about this? What do you tell them to do? You say, well, Israel kind of had to do this. War is bad, but we had to take care of business. I mean, what do you? Is there any kind of action that you or sort of reflections or principles that you have people to get them sort of authentically onto the next level of thinking about it, rather than just sort of throwing up their hands and saying it's horrible and then walking away?
Well, what we try to do in the Jewish community is, broadly speaking, we support Israel. We want to see it thriving. We're bound to Israel by numerous ties, both personal, communal, and religious and historical. And we want to see it succeed. And we think that it falls on us to participate in that effort to build up the state of Israel. And so this doesn't change any of that. If anything, it intensifies our desire to want to see a safe Israel and to build Israel and invest in Israel and protect Israel from her enemies in this country as well as throughout the Western world. At the same time, what I personally have emphasized to our people over many years, and I will do so again this year when I have an opportunity to speak with them about Israel, is that this issue is not going to be resolved except through political negotiations. It cannot be resolved militarily. The Israeli-Palestinian dispute is a political dispute, and it requires a political compromise where both sides will have to make significant compromises. Neither the Israelis or the Palestinians are going anywhere. They have nowhere else to go. So we believe in a two-state solution. We want to see it happen. We want to play our part in that, and here too, in terms of what we say, as well as where we invest. We want to make sure to support that process that ultimately will lead to a two-state solution brought about by political means between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Well, so many people say that Netanyahu hasn't really been acting in good faith, that, he had lots of opportunity to negotiate and all that, but he kind of like ran roughshod over that. I mean, what do you say about that? Do you think that Israel has been doing what it could be doing in good faith to make this solution happen?
It's hard to say. You have to be intimately involved in the process on a daily basis to...
No, but your impression.
My impression is that... I'll give you two basic responses. First of all, the vast majority of Israeli citizens want to see a two-state solution and understand the price from Israel's side that will be required to pay in order to reach that two-state solution. They consider that preferable to no solution, no political solution. That the overwhelming majority in poll after poll after poll has supported that for the last 20 years since the Oslo Accord. I also know that Israel offered the Palestinians a two-state solution 3 times over the last 15 years or so, in accordance with the Clinton parameters. That is basically a return to the 67 lives for for a Palestinian state, demilitarized and so forth. I don't want to go through all the details now. But that essentially the 3 Israeli governments offered the Palestinian Authority over the last 15 years, more or less what were the Clinton parameters and what are the basic parameters that most people would agree are necessary in order to reach a two-state solution. And in each time, the Palestinian Authority rejected it. And they were offered by liberal or more progressive Israeli governments and prime ministers. And then the last thing I would say about this is, if Prime Minister Netanyahu is in fact perceived by the Israeli public as not wanting that two-state solution, whether because he comes right out and says it, which, by the way, he said exactly the opposite at the beginning of his term. He said he was in favor of the two-state solution. But if they believe that that's just rhetoric and they disbelieve him and they perceive that an alternative an alternative government would be able to reach an understanding and an accord with the Palestinian Authority, then Israel, being a democracy, would elect that government. The fact that that hasn't happened is an indication that the Israeli people perceive the issue as I described it to you. And frankly, I perceive it that way too, which is the primary obstacle is actually not on the Israeli side, it's on the Palestinian side. And even those Palestinians that the Western world considers moderate, for understandable reasons, they have refused to sign an end-of-conflict agreement with the Israelis, and that's the primary obstacle. And everything else can be overcome. So unless and until the Palestinians themselves come to a decision that they need to pay the full price for this political solution, there is unlikely to be an Israeli government that will be able to create that two-state solution, either because the Palestinians will reject it every time, or because there will be an Israeli government in place that was elected because the Israeli population